there are these words that we use. Originally, when Mao took power, the people referred to it as renmin. And if you see renmin is everywhere, renmin ribao, renminbi, renmin, it was the people, right? And this is how we were supposed to envision the Chinese people, right? Well, this has always been a tension because the Chinese people are not this unified. So if you notice, Xi Jinping, when he took power, began to have a change of language. He began to use the word minzu, which is more like a nation, a nationality. So people means one thing, but a nation has more of a sense of cohesiveness.
There are many aspects about China's journey from the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1917 to the modern superpower it has become today that are instructive to those who are interested to understand the story. One aspect that is not discussed very well is the evolution of the Chinese language in holding the country together and harnessing it with the literacy required to carry it into the 21st century. The Chinese language is in itself ancient, complex, romantic, and fascinating. But the Young Turks of the May 4th movement in 1919 were determined that the Chinese language had to be Romanized and even replaced because of the cultural shackles that it represented in their quest for keeping up with the Western world. The story that evolved was a fascinating one and is captured in this book, A Billion Voices, China's Search for a Common Language. The writer of this book takes us on a journey from the early initiatives to create a common language, the lively stories of the huge divide between Northerners and Southerners, traditionalists and contemporary speakers, and the hundreds of dialects that used the same text but spoke so differently that Chinese people from different provinces barely understood each other. When Mao Zedong stood on the podium on the 1st of October 1949, he spoke in his heavy Hunan dialect that had to be kept simple to be understood across the nation. It's a fascinating book that captured the all-too-human drama of human egos from the North and South, the fistfights and the verbal abuses from which the process eventually did come together. The writer's name is David Moser. A sinologist with a PhD in Chinese studies from the University of Michigan, he has lived in China for well over 30 years. He intimates a heavy Beijing accent when he wants to, participates in crosstalk sessions on national television, and is very much a part of the story that he writes about. He teaches at Yanqing Academy, Beijing University, and has been a visiting scholar since 1987. And a visiting professor at the Beijing Foreign Studies University.
为什么你的中文比我的中文非常好？
哎，哪里，不会。
是对的，有中国人告诉我。
哎，你想啊，
你什么时候开始学习中文？
你想，我80年代开始学中文，
是吗？
很早
啊。
对。
然后谁的教你？什么时候
教中文？我中文是自学的，我从来没上过课，但是我娶了一个中国太太。然后跟他每天上课，就跟他那个生活，然后有时候吵架，我每次就输得很惨。
My interest in all things cultural, there's an economic, social, political element in there, and then you actually dealt with those things. Those were the defining characters that brought the language together.
Right.
And the Putonghua that we speak now is a simplification of an extraordinary problem that they had on the language front, right? And in the book, what you did very well was you superimposed the transliteration of Chinese civilization itself, that transformational phase from 1914. And how language was very much a part of that. So you captured the May 4th movement, you captured, Sun Yat-sen, and then the committees that were put together by that era of leaders, and then the Kuomintang, and then the Communist Party, and then right up to today. You just captured the essence of the flow of how the country created its linguistic identity. And when you did that in the book, you also captured the interesting idiosyncrasies of language, which really there's an oral element to it, there's a written element to it. And in China, the two are so not necessarily together
Right.
all the time, you know. And so you captured that very well. And then the committees themselves and
Right.
the personalities, you know, the things that you had to say about Wu Chuhui, the original chairman of the committee, I was so funny. It was like, it's like a character right out of a storybook, you know, a huge personality,
Right.
you know, take it or leave it, you know, talking down to the southern people and so on. And then later on you had Chao Yan-ren, who actually translated the work of, you know, Bertrand Russell. Did he actually translate that famous book by Bertrand Russell on China?
No, he was Bertrand Russell's translator when he was in China, along with John Dewey and other people. He translated Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland into Chinese.
David explains in his book that when Alice in Wonderland was translated into Chinese, new Chinese words had to be invented to capture the new English words. Cao's Wu Liao de Hua was Chinese for Jabberwocky. The mouse's long and sad tail was also a pun on the word tail in Alice in Wonderland. Neither the Chinese words for tail, or gusha, or tail, weiba, captured the pun well. So Cao did an ingenious job of transliterating the pun itself. He played with the Chinese word wei qi, which loosely means grievance, and came up with a made-up combination, wei qi, that literally meant a tail in a curved shape and looked sad, thereby capturing the pun.
And that in itself is a story, because Alice in Wonderland itself is allegorical and you know, even in the English language,
Right.
it created a lot of new words. And that whole story of how he created new words in Chinese that transposed
Right.
that. So there's a lot to have in terms of a conversation with you. Okay, so first I'm going to ask you about the book itself. When was that book published? In
2016.
What were you struggling with most of all when you were putting the book together in trying to tell the story of how China unified its language?
It was a problem. I think you can see that the book is very condensed, and they wanted that. They said, don't make it too long. So it was hard to condense all that historical information into a short book. But actually, it was not that hard for me, because the issues that were dealt with, that the country was dealing with, and that the language planners were dealing with, were actually the same kind of issues that we foreigners, that I deal with and dealt with when I first started learning Chinese. This notion that the characters are not phonetic, or they're very own mildly phonetic, that there's so many of them, that they're simplified and complex ones. And then also the reality of the dialects, because most people don't realize when they're studying, you know, standard Mandarin or Putonghua in other countries, when they come here, the first reality they face is everyone doesn't speak that language, and everyone doesn't speak with that accent. So all those problems and issues that I'd been struggling with for 30 years, it was my task was just to explain them very clearly and simply for the novice reader, for the non-specialist reader. So that was my challenge, and it was hard to do. The book was like 3 times longer when I finished it, and it was a process of cutting lots and lots of content before I got it to the final
But
point.
it was technically sophisticated and yet simple. It captured the sophistication of language in a very simple way. And then it told a story as well. The things that I took away from the book, which I'd like to have your views on, firstly is the largeness of life of the personalities involved in shaping China. Tell us a little bit about that, and do you see those large personalities today?
Very good question. Well, I'll answer the first part first. I think it's important to realize that when the story starts is at the fall of the Qing dynasty. And you have to think of where China was and where the intellectuals and the leaders were at that time. And what they were facing, really, as patriotic intellectuals, was cultural survival. I mean, China, we tend to to forget looking at China the way it is now, that China was on the verge of being overrun, taken over, invaded.
And he was pulling in every different direction.
Pulling in every direction.
And linguistically so, right?
And also there was the May 4th movement in particular, had this, not really them, but the late Qing, there was this shock of discovery of the West and how far they were ahead of China technologically and in terms of political systems and ideologies. So these people, in part, they were great because they had a great problem to solve, which was how do we make China strong again? How do we Westernize? Does that mean the same thing as modernize? Is Westernization and modernization the same? And part of all of this process was the language. And you have to read my book to get the full story, but part of the problem was that China's language, written language, well, there were two problems. One was that there was no such thing as the Chinese language. And once the Qing dynasty fell and the Republic of China took power, one of their challenges was to emulate what they saw the great powers of Europe, the great countries like England, like Germany, which to them, they looked at this model and they said, all these countries, what do they have in common? It's one people, one country, and one language. All these countries had a unified language. And particularly Japan even had gone through a similar sort of process during the Meiji Restoration. And when the first Japanese War broke out, the Chinese suddenly realized these Japanese armies are so strong and efficient. One of the reasons was they could all speak a common language and they're all literate. They could all read. And China was filled with people who were, a vast number of people in the countryside who were moderately or illiterate, and there was no single language that they all spoke. But basically, these thinkers and these writers and these creators, they were solving a bigger problem than just language unification. They saw this as the only way to get China to become strong and powerful like a Western country. So people like Lu Xun, the writer, people like Chen Duxiu, people like Hu Shi, these great figures of the early 20th century, they all had this in common, that they all were directed at reforming the language. And what's always fun for me when Chinese people read the book or Chinese people learn about what I'm writing about, there's aspects of this that Chinese people in fact don't know and they haven't read about in the history and they're surprised to find out. And one of them is that, first of all, the May 4th writers were very anti-Confucian. They were saying we've got to get rid of Confucius. His ideology is retrograde, it's patriarchal, it's sexist, and all this thing. But the other thing they attacked was the Chinese characters themselves. And this is something that a lot of Chinese really don't know. People like Lu Xun and all other writers, and some of the characters that you're talking about, like Chen Xuetong, right? Were sort of rabid, kind of viciously critical of their own culture because they saw this as a drag on the culture. So there were lots of very serious writers who were saying, we've got to eliminate the Chinese characters because they're a drain on the intelligentsia and they're a bar to literacy. It's a block on literacy. That you can't expect illiterate peasants to learn how to write 5,000 Chinese characters. So the Chinese language and the writing system had become very elite, very overly complicated, and it really took an entire lifetime to master that and to be able to read. And they said, we've got to do what the foreign countries did. We've got to have a vernacular literature, and we've got to have a writing system that it's easy to people to read and is phonetic. So these big characters you're talking about, they were big because they had to think big. They couldn't afford to just get in their ivory tower and just continue. They had to actually solve huge problems. And part of the fun for me in the book was to explain why they had a sense of crisis and how this led to the advocacy of enormous changes in the culture and the language.
In fact, this thing about people who think big, there's a form of democracy, there's a form of consensus building mechanism at play here, which a Westerner would not call democracy, but yet there's a consensus building process, and not everything comes together by dictate or
Right.
or something like that. That plays out very strongly in your book, and it still plays out today. And that is one of the reasons I was so excited to have this chat with you, because when I talk to the economists, that's how China's economic policies, responding to global challenges, right?
Right.
And there is a global consensus, like in economics, you have the Washington consensus, which is neoliberal and so on, bearing down on developing countries, and then there's China developing its own response and then pushing back, the global themes. And in the case of the written word, what you're saying is that there was this thinking that it should be Romanized,
Right.
But Romanization never happened. Where is it now? Is there still that second thought that maybe at some point the Chinese written language will be Romanized in order to give it a lot more currency or flexibility or something like that?
The push for Romanization really became stronger before Mao took power, and we know that when Mao was at Yan'an preparing, his troops for the eventual conquest or what's the liberation of Beijing,
yeah.
Jiefang, right? That one of the first things they wanted to do was eliminate the characters and initiate a kind of a Romanized system, and they already had one that they were using to teach Chinese to the peasants at Yan'an. But Mao took power, and he had so much on his plate, and he promised to do this and didn't do it, which is probably a pretty good idea. It would have been a disaster. Right now, this issue of the characters is a little bit irrelevant because of the computer. So it was continually relevant throughout the 50s, 60s, and in the teaching of Putonghua, which they had to develop pinyin but pinyin was just an aid in pronunciation. It was never meant to be a Romanized version of Chinese that you could read out loud. So it was always a problem. Even when I came here in the 1980s, it was a huge problem for foreigners learning because the writing system was not phonetic. So you had to go to learn these onerous tasks of looking up a word in the dictionary and trying to remember what it is and learning the pinyin system and learning how to write the characters by hand. In a way, all of that's gone by the wayside, and it's not relevant now because they have the computer, you have digital tools, and people no longer have to write by hand. So there's no reason to cancel the characters now because they can work in cyberspace, they can work quite well in the digital world. The only task you need to do is learn how to recognize them, but that's much easier than learning how to write them right. The other part of my book that is, though, relevant now is the dialects. And that's very important because it's really, I think you hit on something, that there's something important about understanding the modern state and what the problems are trying to solve. Because, the problem was that China was never a monolithic entity like we tend to think that it is or was. There's illusions of that because everyone was reading the same books and reading the same characters and supposedly engaged in the same. But in fact, China was always a very diverse country, culture. The diversity was always there. And when Mao took power in 1949, it was still there. And that meant you had a lot of different regions that spoke not just different accents, but totally different languages that are as different as French and Italian. And you had different regional, ethnicities that didn't speak. There were the Han dialects that were different dialects of the Han language, and then there were like Tibetan and Uyghur and all this stuff.
Yeah.
So that was a fact of Chinese life. It's still true today. And the tension now, that I can only give you just some idea of, the tension now is one that started when they began to try to unify the language. And the question was, all right, China's quite diverse, and we have all these different regions and dialects. And do we want to create a common language so that everyone can just speak the same language and communicate when they're together, but let the local dialects and local cultures continue to function and to proceed into the 21st century as a separate kind of system? Or is the hope, is the ultimate goal that Putonghua, the national language, will gradually supplant these dialects, that they will gradually erode and go away, and we will have a unified country that only speaks one language. There are these words that we use. Originally, when Mao took power, the people referred to it as renmin. And if you see, renmin is everywhere. Renmin Ribao, renminbi, renmin, it was the people, right? And this is how we were supposed to envision the Chinese people, right? Well, this has always been a tension because the Chinese people are not this unified. If you say that Tibetans in a monastery and Mandarins in Zhongnanhai are all the same people, they're not. They're very, very different people with very different mindsets. So this became a little bit troubling to them as they began to try to move China and unify it, not only linguistically, but also politically. So if you notice, Xi Jinping, when he took power, began to have a change of language. He began to use the word minzu, which is more like a nation, a nationality. So people means one thing, but a nation has more of a sense of cohesiveness. A nation, we're a nationality, like an ethnic nationality. In English, we also say a nationality is like an ethnic group, right? So you see these signs around Beijing in Chinese saying, if the people have faith, then the nation has hope, and then the country is strong. So there you see, the people is just everyone no matter, but the nation is a different thing. And so they begin to sort of push in the direction of having everyone speak the same language, not just because it was a communication tool, but because it was a patriotic thing to do. And it's very interesting, in the promotional materials for Putonghua, they're very explicit. It says, learn Putonghua and be a good patriot. And they even say explicitly, learn Putonghua and strengthen the cohesiveness of the Chinese nation. It's not just a linguistic agenda, it's a political agenda.
It is. In fact, if I were to draw the timeline in your book, the questions that the May 4th revolutionaries were asking themselves, what do we need to unshackle in order to free our being Chinese? And then when the country was coming together, it's like, what do we need to hold us together?
Right.
And then, because of wealth, actually, if you fly now to Chengdu, they insist on speaking their own local dialect, and Beijing and Putonghua is for when you go to Beijing. You don't speak that in Chengdu. And the Shanghainese, since 10 years or so ago, they've started teaching Shanghainese in schools.
That's right.
So, and then you have the Guangdong problem, which is the Pearl River Delta.
And that has to do with Hong Kong also. Yeah.
And then you've got Hong Kong in there. In fact, it was just this week that President Xi made a speech saying that we are a multicultural country. And that I thought was a major milestone. That we are a plural society, we are a cosmopolitan country, we're not one country.
Right.
And he didn't say Xiao Mingsu, he said Mingsu, right? So,
so nation,
right? So he wasn't speaking like a Han speaking Chinese, speaking to the minority in that sense. We're all one people, one nation. So I see that
there's a tension there. There's a tension.
There's a tension, and there's an intention as well. And I guess that what's happening there is that they are finding their way along without forcing it, because they know that if they forced it, there will be tensions and reactions from different parts of society.
Well, they occasionally go overboard, whether you mandate that the schools teach in the local dialect or they teach in Putonghua. And that has been a losing battle for the ones who want to keep the local dialect in the school, as they say, no, only Putonghua in the schools. Well, once that happens, the children forget how to learn the local dialect, and not only the dialect, that whole culture dies out. So, but then there are tensions there too, because the parents, they don't want to see their kids grow up and become estranged from their own culture, and they can't talk to their grandparents. But they also want their kids to be able to assimilate into Chinese culture and speak standard Mandarin so they can get a job. So even the parents are conflicted. Do we just let the dialect go away, or do we, somehow try to keep both of them there so that they have a cultural identity and they also have, a national identity? It's a tough problem. And
the interesting thing about what you say in your book was that because of the revolutionaries in the May 4th movement, there was a de-emphasizing of Confucianism,
right.
And there's a discussion of how much of Confucianism is actually carried in the literature, in the text, in the word. there was 50 years of that, and then there's a resurgence of Confucianism. How much of Confucianism was lost, and what is the Confucianism that exists today?
That's a very, very good question. Of course, Chairman Mao was part of that May 4th soup, let's put it that way. He was in with those people. So when he took power, Confucius was not something that he wanted to be part of the new China at all. So, I mean, as we know, he banned Confucius. I mean, he critiqued Lin Biao and Confucius, right? And little kids are supposed to say, down with Lin Biao. Confucius says, who's Lin Biao? And who's Confucius? They don't even know, right? So Mao was adamantly opposed to it. In the 1980s, when Deng Xiaoping took power, there was a loosening of Confucian studies as an academic aspect, but then also there was a loosening of religious studies overall. I mean, you could now study Buddhism, you could study other things. After the Reform and opening up in the 80s and the 90s, there began to be a sense that China had lost a sort of a moral compass. And part of the reason was there was no indigenous kind of value system that they could point to. If you say, well, it's Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, but there's nothing in that tells you how to be a moral person. You be a good person by just supporting the party and supporting Marxism, Leninism. That doesn't tell you much. So there was, and also they noticed that lots of people were turning to Christianity, they were turning to Buddhism or other kinds of religions. And it was obvious that there was a felt need for some kind of a moral sense. Society seemed to them to be heading towards chaos, right? So now enters Confucius. They said, well, Confucianism has several advantages. It's indigenous Chinese value system. It's not a religion. I mean, the metaphysical component is virtually zero. And it also stresses order, obedience to authority, family values, and so on, right? So, of course, it's pretty sexist, but you do what the Catholic Church did to Christianity, which is they cut out all the parts they don't want and put in all the good stuff, and that's the core mantra, right? So now we have Confucius Institutes, and everything's named after Confucius. It's not that Confucius really had a comeback, because if you talk to the people out in the street here, no one's going to say, are you a Confucian? They say, what are you talking about? No. But the upshot of all this is Confucianism is still in the Chinese DNA. And this notion of the way they treat families, that harks back to Confucian values.
Also, what's interesting is the way in which Chinese people build knowledge has changed. In the days of the dynasties, it was a mandate from heaven and so on. And then Chan Chen turned it around with the three Minshu, Minshen, and Mingsheng. And it's from the ground up now. And when you turn something like Confucianism from the ground up as opposed to an edict that a value system that is imposed on you, it begins to look different. It's something that can be translated by ordinary people. I think you've said that the reason Confucianism gained popularity is because ordinary people are able to comment on it and contextualize it.
Yeah, it's embedded. It's embedded in the language, not just in the texts and things, but in the ways that people talk, right? So they, in everyday life, will use these Confucian terms like ren and yi, benevolence and righteousness, right? And the way they talk about, xiaoshun, there's a word, we don't even have a word for that in English, filial piety, but that's a concept in China. Even the fast bullet trains are they call hexie, the harmonious society, So it's embedded in the Chinese value system without even explicit. It was during Mao period as well. It's just that we couldn't talk about it explicitly. So yeah, I think it's something the Chinese couldn't get rid of, and it's part of the value system. And this notion of cooperation and hierarchy is baked into the system, really.
Now, here's something that is personal to me, and I really want to know from you, which is I have face-to-face classes, and my teachers also do classes with me on WeChat. I have any number of application tool sets and so on. Give me a sense of your own Chinese journey.
Wow. Well, in a way, the first part of my journey has nothing to do with now because the realities are so different. When I first started learning, the only way to do it was with books and usually pre-prepared sort of books that had all the translations there. And just looking up one character in a dictionary could take a minute or 2 or 3 minutes. So the problem with back then was the same one we have now, tones and grammar, but also how do you use reading to increase your listening and speaking. You alluded to it a minute ago. The problem with the Chinese language is in an alphabetic language, reading, speaking, and listening are all one skill. Because if you can read it, then you can say it, and if you can say it, you can hear it, and it reinforces each other. In Chinese, the characters are just mute usually. You see a character, you don't know what it means, you don't know how to pronounce it, so you first got to get the sound. And then when you get the sound, you've got to get the meaning, and then you've got to remember the sound again when you see the character, and that's a very slow process, right? So that was my reality then. I quickly learned something that the teachers sort of don't understand, even the ones now. And it's just a linguistic truism that we've known for hundreds of years. Saussure, the French linguist, says the core, the essence of language is speaking, is the oral language, not the written language. And because Chinese is so visually oriented and the characters are so important, Chinese teachers used to and still make the mistake of thinking, we got to get these characters into the person's head. They got to learn what they look like, write them. And that's just totally backwards. And usually when I learn French or I learn another European language, there's no question because the writing, the speaking, and the listening are all part of the same thing. But in Chinese, you have to make a choice. You can't do it all at once because it will delay you so many years. So what I learned was that I need to learn how to speak this language. And then whatever I can learn to read and write will come along naturally as the years go by. But I've got to jump in and start really speaking. And the only way to do that was to design my own curriculum and to basically I had to say, what do I need to say and how much do I need to say it? So I kept little books and things and I would say, how do you say this? And they would tell me and I said, oh, I got that. And it wasn't usually just a word or a character, it was an entire phrase, right? And that's how I did it. And most other people were still like reading the textbooks. I never did the textbooks. I did it all on my own. And people who went through the courses would say, it's going to take you 4 or 5 years to even get to where you can do anything. And I said, screw that. I don't want to waste 5 years of my life just so I can. So I jumped in. I started learning xiangsheng, which is crosstalk, this comedy form.
Which you're very good at.
That increased my Chinese a lot. But I got people to help me by transcribing the scripts, and then I would listen to it and I could speak it. Nowadays, I would say, my advice would be, you don't have to worry about the characters. Writing is not an important skill. Don't let them tell you you have to do 听写, write 50 characters a day. The skill is recognizing them, and you don't need to go through this process. You can digitize it. You can use the Plecos dictionary or whatever. You can take a text and just have the computer read it out loud to you, or you can just press a button and look at the tones and the definitions. So I say, live in the digital world, process Chinese to the digital world, but in everything you learn, try to focus it on speaking. So read things that will help you speak. So read dialogues, read movie scripts, read TV scripts, right? Of course, read anything you want, but read some classical Chinese, read anything you want. But basically try to read text that will help your ear and help you speak. That's my advice.
That's very good, but what you're saying is that now that we have all these technological aids tools that we can use them. In living in China, how much of an American are you still, and how much of a Chinese have you become? I ask this because today, because of the internet and because of the polarization of views on culture and on countries and geopolitics and all that, there is it's either this or that kind of a view. There are Americans who would not like China at all. Chinese are generally gracious towards Americans.
Yeah.
I see that as well. They only ask to be respected for what they are.
That's right.
But at the same time, there are things which are Chinese, which needs to be discussed critically when you're part of this society. So, where are you now in terms of, what happens to you when you see all these differing views being thrown at you?
Yeah, it's very kind of confusing. Things have changed so much in the last 10 years. I mean, if we'd had the same conversation 20 years ago, I think I would have very different thoughts.
Which will be?
Before 2010, in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, when the internet came along, I would have told you, oh, the two cultures are just merging, they're coming together. There's a lot of common ground, we have a lot of common language. They actually want the same things we do, and they're becoming more westernized. We're happy to learn their culture, and more academics are coming here. Everything is kumbaya, is what I would have said. I would have thought, there's some hurdles I have to go through, and there's some sticking points, but basically the two cultures are just merging. Now I wouldn't say that. I would say, because of various things, political aspects, that it's sort of like what the internet and communication has done all over the world. You would think that a common language and lots of familiarity with the other person would create a sympathy, empathy, and cooperation and positive feedback. Quite the opposite. The new media and the internet and everything has created a new space where people can create tribal identities, and you know this very well, where now, you know, there are these information bubbles. You know, China may know a lot about the U.S., but now they know almost too much. They know exactly what we say about them, and they don't like it. One of my obsessions now is this deficit or asymmetry between the information in China and the information in the United States. The Chinese know a lot more about us than we know about them. And that goes for America especially. And I think that's dangerous. It's very, very dangerous for many reasons we can talk about. But I think I wouldn't have been saying this in 1999 or 2005. But I think we're in a real crisis now, because the internet and these tools have not brought us back sort of closer together. It's created a kind of a similar left-right polarity in the United States and with the Republicans and Democrats. I look at Chinese media now, and I think this looks like the Fox News of China, and then, you know, the actual Fox News is there, and then they have a Fox News now here in which, you know, you cannot say anything good. Anything good is not welcome on that channel, and so we're caught, and it's dangerous. It's very dangerous. As to me as an American, I'm an American. I can't change that. My body language, everything. I'm still an American. I realize that that's not something I can change, but it's not something I care about. And most Chinese people don't care. They want me to be an American. But what has changed since I got here is I've realized that there's a lot of values that I had interiorized and I still apply, that I now feel a little bit ashamed of, or a little bit sorry about, that I see as American, and I realize that there's Chinese values that counteract those, or that are oppositional to those. And there's a lot of things we can study about Chinese, the way of being a person in Chinese culture. But having said that, of course, there's plenty that they admire about us, and they will say it openly. You know, their entrepreneurship, their creativity, their fearlessness to pursue new ideas. And I'll tell you a story. This is so telling. I was teaching a class that had my American undergraduate students and their Chinese roommates in the same classroom. And so we were talking about cultural differences. And one of the Americans mentioned, well, a new thing, you know, we talk about YOLO, Y-O-L-O, you only live once. And the American said, yeah, I would say that's one of my values. I mean, we try to, like, YOLO, yeah. And one of the Chinese students said, yes, I agree, that is so wise. YOLO, you only live once. That means that whatever you do, you should be very cautious. Don't take any undue risks. Don't do anything that might harm you or you know, create problems, you know. And I just said, oh my God, this is such a crystallization of the Chinese way of looking at things and the American way of looking at things. And they're both correct, right? They're both correct. But there's just a different orientation there that I could see crystallized in that, right? Anyway, so I mean, I think you agree with me that those differences are quite precious, really. We need to find ways to merge those, understand those, and we're in a position right now where no one's in the mood to talk about that synergy. People are now only in the mood to restore respect, autonomy, sovereignty, shut up and let me do what I want to. It's tragic. It's very sad.
I'm actually benefiting from you and a whole range of people, both Chinese and foreigners living in China, and you need to live here to make sense of the reality that's already been created. The buildings are real, the railway is real, the roads are real, the lifestyle is real, and the luxury and the comforts are real. This is not a figment of someone's imagination. This country has done well for itself. And when a country of this size does well for itself, it has a voice and it has a dignity that we all must pay attention to. How we contextualize according to our own dignity, depends on a number of factors. Of course, nobody likes to be pushed back. No. Western civilization doesn't enjoy being pushed back and being told that it's passé now or something like that. So there's a dynamics in motion at the moment. And it's very important to keep an open mind. And it's for people like us who live here, who do business here, who interact with the people here, that we realize you don't just label the country and call it something and then put it away in a box. This is not a country that you can do that.
But there's from Singapore, right? Do you think that affects the way you perceive China? I mean, me as an American is quite different. There's all kinds of things. I mean, you must experience things differently from the American.
Well, to some extent, coming from Singapore and coming from a former colonial heritage helps me to see both sides.
Right.
And something else, which I think hasn't been added into the equation. Countries like Singapore, Malaysia, and then you've got Korea and Japan are precursors to what China is today. We are the forerunners of what China eventually became.
You were even the model.
We were the original model. We were
model.
The proof of concept, right? And then you see how it transformed an entire country. So I have a mental map, a timeline with which I see what's happening. The purpose of this conversation is to capture the essence of how you saw certain decisions being made in an area that people don't even think about, which was language. And it's so interesting reading your book that I saw committees at work, I saw personalities at work, I saw policies shifting over time, I saw nations being created on the back of putting a language together, and the pushback today on the unifying nature of language.
Thank you.